Welcome to the Analytic Christian, the channel where we explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm Jordan, and tonight we're going to be looking at something called the problem of heaven argument. This is an argument that begins with the premise that there is necessarily no evil in heaven and aims to show that a God of a certain type of nature, namely this perfect being, did not create our universe. I'm referring specifically to Graham Oppy's version of the problem of heaven argument. And I'm very grateful to be joined by Dr. Kevin Timpe, a professor of philosophy at Calvin College. And I'm going to go ahead and bring Dr. Timpe in now. Dr. Timpe, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on the show today.
What got you interested in the topic of free will and the problem of heaven?
I mean, really, it was my first philosophy class as an undergraduate got me interested in philosophy in general, in part by just asking and encouraging us to think about a number of questions that I had been thinking about for a while that had not always been appreciated to be thought about, namely various versions of the problem of evil. I had some youth pastors growing up that didn't necessarily always appreciate me asking, but what about this over here? I've got this question. And also, I was just really interested in issues about free will. And so I remember in one of my very first philosophy classes, we read Al Plantinga's God, Freedom, and Evil. And so that just kind of has stuck with me. In graduate school, I was interested in a number of things, including some of the debates about free will, and did my dissertation just on the metaphysics of free will. And then I've always had sort of a secondary interest in philosophy of religion. On my view, to do philosophy of religion well, you have to do at least one other discipline in philosophy well. You've got to do metaphysics or epistemology or ethics. There's interesting stuff, the history of medieval philosophy that intersects with these things. I think that more and more people are doing interesting work in philosophy of religion that is political philosophy as well. And so just when there are a number of places where free will issues come up in philosophy of religion, and I remember reading some arguments, taking seriously as some of their premises the view of free will that I hold, and trying to show that certain religious conclusions can't or don't follow. And I thought, that'd be worth thinking about a little bit more. And one of the best things about being a professional philosopher is that when I find stuff interesting, I just, manage to teach a class on it or decide to write on it for a while. And so started doing it, and then Tim Paul and I took a handout that I had made for one of my classes and sort of developed it into our first article dealing with the problem of heavenly freedom.
That's awesome. And I've had Dr. Tim Paul on to discuss the incarnation. He's got I really like his view on the incarnation. And so you should check that out. But I want to talk about the problem of heaven argument. So I'm first going to ask you, what is the argument?
So the argument, and there's actually a number of folks that make different versions of the argument. But in one of its most well-known versions, it's in a book by Graham Oppy, and it goes like this. And this is his formulation of it. Premise one, necessarily there is no evil in heaven. In other words, it's not just a contingent fact that there's not any evil in heaven. There's something about the very nature of heaven itself that rules out the existence of evil. Not only, but sort of with a specific eye towards moral evil or sin. The second premise goes, if there is morally significant freedom in heaven, then it's not the case that necessarily there is no evil in heaven. In other words, if a certain understanding of free will is the case, then it can't be that necessarily there is no evil in heaven. In other words, if there's this kind of freedom, then the first premise in the argument would be false. And so then subconclusion in 3, therefore, there is no morally significant freedom in heaven. 4, heaven is a domain in which the greatest goods are realized. And so this is trying to unpack what the nature of heaven is. 5, another subconclusion, therefore, the greatest goods can be realized in a domain in which there is no morally significant freedom, because heaven is an instance, according to the argument, of just that type of domain. 6, therefore, a perfect being can just choose to make a domain that contains the greatest goods and no evil, because if God is omnipotent, then God can create any of these sorts of domains, but we've just said in 5 that there is such a domain. Premise 7, or step 7 in the argument, a world that contains the greatest goods and no evil is non-arbitrarily better than any world that contains the greatest goods, incomparably lesser goods, and the amounts and kinds of evils that are found in our universe. In other words, roughly, if we're going to compare two worlds, the one that has, or maybe world types, the world type that has the greatest goods and no evil is better, and better for a principled reason, than worlds that has the greatest goods, but also has evil in it, right? Like all else being equal, we'd like to not to have evil and sin. And so if a perfect being chooses among the various options when the perfect being is creating an option that is and one option is non-arbitrarily better than the other, then the perfect being is going to choose that option. In other words, right, in virtue of God's perfection, God is going to choose the best, or from among the best options that are better than, in this non-arbitrary way, from other sorts of worlds. And so the argument seeks to show as its final conclusion, therefore, it's not the case that a perfect being made our universe, right? So it's an argument against a certain kind of theistic picture. And the argument, like most contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, I think has specifically Christian understanding of God here in mind. I don't think there's anything in 1 through 9 that is exclusively Christian. But the way that the folks writing on this argument, if they take a stand on which particular religious tradition they're operating in, it's typically done in a Christian context. And so there's, I think, at least an implicit assumption, the way that this argument goes, that it's sort of taking aim at maybe not only, but specifically a certain version of Christian theism.
Yeah. And thank you for explaining the argument. You walked us through all 9 steps. And I'll say this for the audience's sake. Step 3, 5, 6, and 9 are just conclusions that follow from the other premises. So in order to deny, as long as it's a valid argument, in order to deny those premises there, or I'm sorry, in order to deny those blue lines, the conclusions, you're going to have to deny the premises. So I just wanted to point out why I highlighted those in blue. Now, how do you respond to this argument?
I think there's a number of different ways. And so what I thought I would do is just sort of walk through maybe 4 of the ways that I've heard different folks kind of respond to it. I don't think that all of these are equally good, but I want to point out that there's a number of options. And it might be that somebody endorses more than one of these options in response. So they're not all taken to be exclusive. And they're also not intended to be exhaustive, right? There might be others besides these 4, but I suspect for today's purposes, walking through a number of these would be sufficient. So the first way to respond is in a sense just to kind of grant the argument that, right, if you have these sorts of initial premises, then the conclusion would follow, to grant that it's valid. And to say, you know what, like the only way then, if it's valid to deny the conclusion, is to deny one or more of the premises. And so this is, in this, Tim, Paul, and I call these concession arguments. They concede that the argument is valid and try to get rid of one or more of the premises that generates the problem of the conclusion that perhaps one is hoping to deny. Back when I taught in San Diego, I had a colleague who had a pair of papers on the nature of heaven. And what Donnelly did is just sort of concedes that this would be a problem for a certain understanding of heaven, and then denies that understanding of heaven. So he writes in one of these papers, to think that when one attains heaven, due to the achievement of some degree of moral perfection, one no longer needs to be free and capable of evil, or specifically sin, is to misunderstand the Christian notion of heaven. Right? So here in this quotation, you see that he has in mind a particular Christian understanding of the nature of heaven. And Donnelly just concedes that, and actually Donnelly wrote this before Oppy's work on this, so he's sort of anticipating it. But if we could bring them into dialogue, Donnelly would just concede that, yeah, you've raised this really important problem for this particular understanding of heaven, but we ought just to reject that particular understanding of heaven. And so on Donnelly's understanding, heaven is the kind of place where people can, even in the post-mortem life, get into. That's a different argument for why you could get into heaven, but also leave. And so heaven is the kind of place that you can sin your way out of. And so that just involves him denying premise one of Oppy's argument. Necessarily, there is no evil in heaven. And again, as I understand it, that's one way to resist the conclusion, but it does go against a pretty substantial part of the Christian tradition. As far as I know, there is no creedal statement that heaven has to be the kind of place that there is no evil and thus no sin in. But for most of Christian theological history, that seems to be the understanding. And my general view is we ought not disagree with Christian, fairly uniformly understood Christian theological claims unless we have good reason to, right? So again, it's not obvious to me that you couldn't reject that conclusion or reject Donnelly's way of responding to the argument, but it seems like it's going too quickly a place that we probably don't need to go.
Okay, so that's the first way you can respond to the argument, to deny that first premise.
Yep.
What are the other ways?
So the second way, and this is, I think, fairly influential, maybe not in this, with respect to this particular argument, but there's a view in contemporary philosophy of religion called Molinism that, again, this goes back to God, Freedom, and Evil that I had mentioned earlier as one of the first philosophy of religion texts that I read as an undergraduate. And probably the most influential, or one of the two most influential proponents of Molinism in the past 30, 40 years has been Al Plantinga. Tom Flint, one of Plantinga's colleagues at Notre Dame for a long time, has also done a lot. But the view goes back to a Spanish Jesuit, Luis de Molina. And it looks like Plantinga sort of came up with the same sort of view that Molina had on his own, thinking about things. And this is Flint's way of characterizing Molinism. He says that there are two pillars of Molinism. The first is a commitment to libertarian freedom with respect to humans. And so libertarianism is the conjunction of incompatibilism and the existence of free will. There's a number of different views in the contemporary literature about what free will is, but the compatibility question is one way of spreading those, or sort of demarcating those views into two different camps. The compatibilist thinks that free will, or the existence of free will, is compatible with the truth of determinism, either causal determinism or theological determinism. And the incompatibilist thinks that free will is incompatible with the truth of determinism. Again, either theological or causal determinism. So if you're an incompatibilist who also believes that there is free will, you then are committed to the falsity of determinism. But the conjunction of incompatibilism with belief in free will is a view that gets called libertarianism in the literature. And so Flint is working with, and Molina is working with, an incompatibilist view of freedom. If God creates us and gives us free will as the incompatibilist understands it, then God can't determine or ensure that we use that freedom in a particular way. So there's a certain degree of providential handoff, so to speak, in how the world happens, how the world unfolds, if God creates us and gives us libertarian freedom. So the commitment to libertarianism is one basis of Molinism, but Molinism also wants to have a very strong view of providence, as strong as possible, having libertarianism. So what's unique to Molinism is this idea that God has what's called middle knowledge. God has knowledge not just of necessary truths, truths that are true prior to, logically or temporally, any of God's volitions, right? So it might be that God knows that God's nature is love, and God knows that that's necessarily true, and God knows that it's true not because God makes it true, but just because that's God's nature. And then there's also natural knowledge of contingent truths that God knows after, logically or temporally, his decision to create, right? So God knows that I'm having a drink right now, and since my existence is contingent, then my having a drink is contingent, but I only exist because God created a world in which I exist, and so it's posterior to or after his knowledge. Middle knowledge, it takes one feature from both natural knowledge and free knowledge. So the idea is that there are some things that are contingently true, but still prior to God's volitions. And the kind of such truth that is important for the Molinist is what gets called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And the name's probably not the most helpful name, because some of these aren't in fact going to be counter to fact, and so that calling them counterfactuals is a bit tricky. But the idea is that these are contingently true statements about what free creatures would do if they were in particular circumstances, even if those circumstances don't hold, right? So if, for instance, you were to show up at my house, I would probably say, hey, it's wonderful to meet you. Can I get you a cup of coffee, right? And I don't know what, I happen to not know what your coffee drinking habits are. But if Kevin were to offer Jordan a cup of coffee at 8:53 at night, and he hadn't just, right, we could spell lots of details here, but the idea is that there are truths about what free creatures would do in these kinds of circumstances.
Yeah,
And
God
so,
knows that I would tell you I hate coffee.
okay,
And
so you would freely reject that, and then I would
yeah,
just drink both of them that I had made, the one for you and the one for me. So the idea at the heart of the Molinist picture is that logically prior to creation, God looks out at what all the true counterfactuals are about all the possible creatures that he could create, and sees what those free creatures would do in all the different possible scenarios that they could be in. And then what God does is he sort of strings all of these together and figures out, if I created this initial set of circumstances, then the counterfactuals and creatures would sort of play out, and he gets the world that is most he's able to get the world that he judges to be the best of those worlds, that is consistent with what the true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are. And so there's a lot more to say about Molinism, but hopefully that's enough of a sort of a overview.
yeah, I think you explained that really well, and I've done a couple of videos where those kind of building blocks are laid out. So we don't have to expand more on that.
Okay. So suppose that's true. And so then what God could do is just the people that he knows are going to be in heaven, right? He just makes sure that heaven doesn't have any of those circumstances in it in which the denizens of heaven, the residents of heaven, would be in the kind of situation such that they would freely choose to sin. So it might be that God looks and say, right, among some of the possible worlds that we might be talking about is at least one world in which I end up in heaven. But say that God knows that I'm really gluttonous with respect to coffee. And so that God knows that if I were to encounter coffee in heaven, that I would freely choose to engage in a gluttonous act. And so what God could do is just use his knowledge of the true counterfactuals to make sure that I'm never in a situation in which I encounter coffee in heaven. So I'm still free. He's not determining that I'm not drinking coffee, but he just uses his providential control to keep me out of sin-prone circumstances. So if God can do something like that, then you could have free creatures that are in heaven, and you get there are no sins in heaven because God just keeps all of us from sin-prone circumstances. Now, what's important to note here is the modality here gets tricky, right? And so modality is that part of philosophy that figures out, among other things, like in what way are things true or false, right? Premise one of this argument is supposed to be a necessary claim. Necessarily, there's no evil in heaven. Not just that there happens not to be, but there is no possible world or no way in which there's evil in heaven. And so what's important to note that on the Molinist picture here, it's possible for me to sin in heaven, right? Because I still have free will. It's just that God keeps me from the relevant sorts of conditions, and he keeps everybody in heaven from the relevant sorts of conditions in which they would sin. And so whether or not that's going to amount to a claim about necessarily there not being any sin or evil in heaven, right, the modal logic here is going to get a little bit tricky. I think there are ways to make Molinism work out that there's necessarily no sin or necessarily no sin in heaven, necessarily no evil in heaven. But in order to get a necessary claim like that, you're going to have to do a fair bit of philosophical work. But again, that's a second way that you could go. Now, I happen to think that Molinism is really explanatorily useful. I just happen to think it's false, right? But if you're a Molinist, then here's you could use the truth of Molinism to find a way to respond to Oppy's argument, I think. So that's the second way that you could do it.
Yeah, if I may ask just one kind of thought, potential objection to that type of response, and you can tell me what you think. I assume that somebody may ask, well, if God can get the result he wants of no sin in heaven by keeping people out of these sin-prone circumstances, then if it's good enough for him to do in heaven, why can't he just do it during this life on earth so that you don't get evil, but you get you don't get evil, but you get these people that are freely doing the right thing?
Yep. So if I could go back to Plantinga, right, who sort of brought Molinism back into at least contemporary debates, he grants that that's logically possible, right? There are possible worlds in which everybody who's created with freedom happens to go right. But remember that God doesn't make the counterfactuals true. God sort of looks out into modal space and sees what people, as a matter of fact, would do in these different circumstances. And as Plantinga understands it, it might just be that the counterfactuals line up so that God can't create any of the worlds that you're asking about. All right, so he suggests that there's this thing called transworld depravity. And if a creature suffers from transworld depravity, and this is the not quite so technical gloss, but if a creature suffers from transworld depravity, then in every possible world in which that creature exists, they're going to choose to sin at least once. And so if I suffer from transworld depravity, then the reason God doesn't create a world in which I exist and I'm free and I don't sin is that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom about me just don't line up to make that kind of world possible. And if every possible creature suffers from transworld depravity, then that's a reason why there isn't a possible world with any free creatures who never go wrong. The kind of Molinist response that I gave a minute ago, it could be that the counterfactuals don't line up for this worldly life, right? Sort of the earthly life. But they do happen to line up in the way that they would need to in order to keep heaven sinless. Or just sort of as a matter of contingent fact. And so this is probably a kind of a loose way to put it. But when God looks out at the various counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, he looks at the ones about pre-heavenly existence and is like, shoot, they don't line up in the way that I wanted in order to have free creatures that don't sin. Oh, but if you look at, the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom for heaven for this set of creatures, hey, they do line up that way, right? So it might just be that God is unlucky with respect to the true counterfactuals prior to heaven and isn't unlucky with the true counterfactuals about heaven. But again, I think that that's fairly unlikely. But in order to show that there's something wrong with Oppy's argument, you don't need it to be likely, you just need it to be possible.
That was excellent. Yeah, very clear. Okay. So there have been two responses so far. One was to deny premise one. The challenge with that is you have to go against the pretty standard understanding throughout church history that there won't be evil in heaven. Not just accidentally, but the key there is necessarily no evil in heaven. It'd be interesting to check and see if the understanding is that it's absolutely necessary. Maybe it is. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. But that's one possible response. And then the second was this Molinist type of response. So you have four total. So let's go to response number 3.
Yeah. So the third response is also, in a sense, at least in contemporary philosophical debates, inspired by Plantinga. And I mentioned earlier that you might be able to endorse more than one of these strategies. They weren't taken to be exclusive. And so, as I understand it, Plantinga endorses not only the Molinist strategy, but the third one here, which is based on the idea of "O Felix Culpa," "Oh happy fall," right? So the basic idea is that there, among all the kinds of goods and evils that are in the world, some are better than others. And if we sort of ranked things from the best goods to good but not quite as good goods to mediocre goods to mild bads to really bads, among the highest category here, right, among the greatest goods are going to be the goods of the incarnation and atonement. Now, when Plantinga deals with O Felix Culpa, he takes the goods of incarnation and atonement to come together, right, to sort of be a package deal. And in the history of Christian theology, there's lots of folks that think you could have one without the other. And so in the medievals, you think that there are some folks who think that there would have been the incarnation even had there not been sin and the need for atonement. There are some folks that think there could have been other ways to accomplish the atonement other than the incarnation, right? But Plantinga takes them as a package deal. And so he writes in a paper entitled O Felix Culpa, "There is also a contingent good-making characteristic of our world, one that isn't present in all worlds, that towers enormously over all the rest of the contingent states of affairs included in our world, the unthinkably great good of divine incarnation and atonement." Right? And so if Plantinga is right, that the incarnation and the atonement are the best goods, or at least two of the best goods, you can't have incarnation and atonement without sin. Again, he takes them as a package deal. You probably could have, I happen to think, incarnation without sin, right? But the very nature of the atonement is the attempt to bring about the unity of people that are no longer united by the nature of sin. So if there is no sin, there is no atonement. And so if among the greatest goods you want to have incarnation and atonement, you can only have those goods if there are sin. But if that's the case, again, if it's the case that the incarnation and the atonement are the best goods or among the best goods, but they require sin, then it's not the case that God cannot create a domain that contains the best goods and no evil or sin. Right? So this is contrary to premise or step 6 in the argument. And it gets tricky because it's not always clear when Oppy lays out this argument exactly how the steps are supposed to go. I mean, in terms of what they're drawing off of, right? So step 6 in the argument is supposed to follow from 5 and some other assumptions, right? But he doesn't always spell out in all the detail exactly what those assumptions are. But if something like the O Felix Culpa line is correct, then you can't have the greatest goods, or at least the greatest created goods, right? The greatest goods with respect to creation, if you didn't have sin. And so that calls into question that there could be this domain that has the best goods but no sin, because if the best goods include atonement, which requires sin, you're not going to be able to have that good without sin at all. And so I've never actually seen the O Felix Culpa argument used as a response to this problem about heaven, but I think that there's definitely a way of developing it that would call into question the inference in the argument up to 6 as Oppy develops it.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm understanding how this O Felix Culpa is being used here. So you said, okay, so the atonement would be one of the best goods, and atonement implies that there's sin.
Because you're atoning for sin, right? And so there's
Yeah, you
nothing
have
to
to do
atone
atoning
for
for
without,
sin.
yep.
But now, so what part of the argument is being targeted here using this strategy?
So if the O Felix Culpa theodicy is correct, then it shows that step 6 is false, right? Step 6 says a perfect being can just choose to make a domain that contains the greatest goods and no evil. But if the O Felix Culpa line is correct, and among the greatest goods are the atonement, then you couldn't have the atonement without evil. So it's going to say that something has gone wrong with the argument by the time we get to step 6. What's not fully clear is exactly where it goes with respect to the way that Oppy has lined it up, right? It might be that it's the O Felix Culpa theodicy is calling into question some of those extra assumptions that are helping us get from 5 to 6. It might be calling into question perhaps 4, right? Again, a lot of it would depend on how we're understanding the domain of heaven, right? If heaven is a temporal domain, whether or not it's supposed to sort of like make the assumptions about the stuff prior to heaven, right? So it might be that heaven has the atonement has happened in it, right? But it no longer has sin in it. So there's the O Felix Culpa response says something has gone wrong with respect to 6, or by the time we get to 6. But it's not clear the way that Oppy has laid out the argument exactly where that would be targeting.
Okay.
We might be able to interpret it in a number of different steps.
I was thinking, since 6 is the conclusion, to deny it, you need to deny one of the premises. But yeah, what you're saying is there's some basically hidden assumptions in these premises, and
there's
it could be targeting those hidden premises,
and maybe that it's targeting that one. So when Oppy develops this in his book, right, what he says about the justification for 6 here is that it follows from 5, appealing to the omnipotence of a perfect being. Right, so he's saying that among the other sort of hidden premises are going to be premises about the what an omnipotent being can do. But it might be that there are other hidden premises in here as well that he hasn't quite gotten to, that are going to be relevant to how we understand the way in which 6 is supposed to follow from the earlier ones. All right, so what the O Felix Culpa response might be doing is targeting some of those hidden assumptions, either there that's also getting us to 6 from 5, or that might be implicit in some of the earlier steps of the argument.
All right, so that addresses 3 of the responses to the problem of heaven argument. Now, as far as I understand, you don't take response 1, you don't take response 2. What about 3? Are you like, maybe not?
I'm not particular. So I'm a little less opposed to this one than the others. But it's not clear to me that some of the assumptions of the O Felix Culpa theodicy are going to be worth it, right? So if, at least as Plantinga develops the argument, the incarnation and atonement are just such great goods that they're going to swamp any other kind of evil, right, that's in the world. And it's not clear to me that that's going to be the case, in part because of what Marilyn Adams has argued in some of her work on the problem of evil. In order to justify a particular evil, right, in light of preventing some worse evil from happening or bringing about a greater good, Adams argues that the good needs to go to the person that's suffering the particular evil in order for it to be justified, right? So there's this person-centered constraint that she has. And it's not clear that that person-centered constraint that Adams develops is either needed or even consistent with the way that the O Felix Culpa argument is often addressed. So I'm not officially opposed to it in the way that I've written about why I think that Molinism is false and thus can't endorse the second one. But I'm less than persuaded that it's going to work. right? So if nothing else, suppose that I'm wrong and the old Felix Culpa response works. Since it's not obvious that it works, I think it'd be good to have sort of a backup strategy, right? And fortunately, I think that there is one. And this is the strategy that Tim, Paul, and I have developed, not only in our first paper on this, but expanded in, I think, 3 papers now. And in order to see this response, we need to pay careful attention to something that is in premise 2 of Oppy's argument, right? Because Oppy's premise 2 doesn't just appeal to any sort of freedom, but it appeals to this very particular sort of freedom, morally significant freedom. And this is a particular kind of freedom that, again, Plantinga sort of spells out. We might think that there's freedom to pick, right, the soda on the left in the refrigerator from the soda on the right on the shelf, but we might think that not a whole lot follows from that, right? So what looks to be value isn't just freedom where it doesn't matter or doesn't really seem to make a difference, especially in the ways in which libertarian freedom and the free will defense play out in response to the problem of evil, right? If free will is going to help provide a response to the problem of evil, it's probably not going to be enough for us to, right, have freedom of only the pick the left-hand soda versus the right-hand soda in the refrigerator case. The way that Plantinga defines morally significant freedom is that a person has morally significant freedom only if they are free with respect to an action that is morally significant for them. And then he explains what he means by a morally significant action. An action is morally significant if it would be wrong for them to perform the action then, but right to refrain it, or vice versa. So an action is going to be morally significant only if there's a difference in the moral valence of what you're doing, right? One option is morally wrong, one option is morally right. And so you're only going to have morally significant freedom if you have freedom with respect to that kind of action, right? Where you've got the choice between, a free choice between at least one morally good action and at least one morally bad action. And again, this is the kind of free will that is often appealed to help explain how freedom responds to the problem of evil, right? So the basic idea is, well, why is there evil? Well, there's different kinds of evil. We might need different responses to different kinds of evil, but there's moral evil, right? People do morally bad things. Why does God allow that? Well, because God gives them morally significant freedom, and sometimes they use that freedom to do morally good actions. Sometimes they use it to do morally bad actions. So a lot of the problem of evil literature is really appealing not just to any kind of free will, not just a libertarian understanding of free will, but a libertarian understanding of free will with respect to morally significant actions, right? But the thing to notice here is that we don't always value morally significant freedom, right? And so it might not be the kind of thing that we think it's always valuable to have. And I think there are at least 3 different reasons to think that it's not always valuable for us to have morally significant freedom, even if it's sometimes valuable for us to have it. The first of which is the way that Plantinga defines morally significant freedom. It looks like God couldn't have it if God is necessarily omnibenevolent or all good, right? Because if what it means to have morally significant freedom is to choose between these 2 live options for you, one of which is morally good, one of which is morally bad, if God's necessarily morally perfect, then all the bad options don't seem to be live options, right? So that, and I think that there are some relevant differences between created beings and God, right? But at least that gives us some reason to think that morally significant freedom isn't always super valuable for us to have. The next step is to think not only that sometimes maybe that God doesn't have it, but there are cases where humans lack it, but it still might be a good thing what they do, a morally relevant thing what they do. And so consider the case of a supererogatory action. If you think there are supererogatory actions, right? Supererogatory actions are morally good actions that, in a sense, go beyond what is morally required because failing to do them isn't morally blameworthy. right? So the basic idea is there's morally bad stuff, there's what morality requires, but sometimes somebody goes beyond what is morally required. But notice if the choice is between a morally good action and a supererogatory action, right? If those are the only two choices that a person has, then in that case, they wouldn't have morally significant freedom as Plantinga describes it, right? Because it's not between a good action and a bad action. But it looks to be that if a human is in a case where the only two options that they have are a morally good action and a supererogatory action, like, that's a pretty good spot to be in. And we might value them being in that kind of spot, right? And then the next step is, and this is what Tim and I try to do in some of our work, is to argue that in fact, it looks like sometimes having morally significant freedom would be a bad thing for humans to have, right? It looks like there are times where we might want to participate in patterns of action such that all the bad ones sort of drop out as live possibilities for us anymore. So this is going to be based on tracing cases in the free will literature. This is what sort of like a roughly Aristotelian moral habituation kind of understanding. So sometimes examples help. So here's an example. Suppose that Alex and Steve are married, right? And Steve says to Alex, you know what? I love you so much that like it would never dawn on me to engage in a sexually inappropriate action with another person, right? Like it wouldn't even cross my mind that that's right. And Alex thinks and is like, that's probably a good thing. But of course, if we go back earlier on in their relationship, maybe when they first started dating, right? Or even before they started dating. I mean, it probably is the case that Steve could have had sexual interest in other sorts of folks, right? But the longer they dated, when they got engaged, when they got married, those sort of options, as Steve got more united with Alex, right? Those things that used to be temptations ceased to be temptations anymore. And it would be really weird if Alex said to Steve, you know what? I believe you that you are such that you can't even be tempted to be unfaithful to me. But I wish that you could, right? Because moral significant freedom is such a good thing. It would, right? It would be better for our relationship if this was a live possibility, right? I mean, that would seem really weird. So it looks like, in at least some cases, what we value isn't morally significant freedom for its own sake. We value morally significant freedom so that we can become certain kinds of persons, that we freely become, such that other options are no longer possible for us, right? And if we think of the nature of love like that in the marriage example, then we might also think something similar about the nature of heaven, right? So suppose that God in this life gives us morally significant freedom, and we can use it to do morally bad things. We can use it to do morally good things. The more we use it to do morally good things, of course, cooperating with grace. I'm not trying to, this is just shorthand. I'm not trying to endorse Pelagianism in passing here. But we cooperate with God and we become more and more united with God, such that what God wants is what we want, and any conflicting desires that we might have to do good but sinful things sort of drop out. Right? There's a way in which that, as I think at the heart of the Christian understanding of heaven, right? It's a perfect union between created beings who are redeemed, justified, sanctified, and God. And so it might be the case that by the time somebody gets in heaven, their character is so formed, so modeled after Christ-likeness, that all these other kinds of options that used to be possible for them just aren't possible given their character anymore. But it might also be the case that they couldn't freely form that kind of character if they didn't have morally significant freedom at an earlier time. So we might value morally significant freedom in order to have the opportunity to develop a certain kind of moral character. But once we have that character, then it looks like having morally significant freedom no longer is as valuable. And as in the marriage case a few minutes ago with Alex and Paul, Peter, Steve, forget the name.
Steve.
Steve.
Yeah,
There we go.
Alex and Steve, I think.
It may be the case that, right, if that morally significant freedom stuck around, like we think that the two people aren't united as much. And so what Tim and I try to do in this work is to show that even if we need to, at some time, appeal to morally significant freedom as valuable and needed to do certain work with respect to the problem of evil, just because it's valuable at some point doesn't mean it's always valuable. And so heaven might be the kind of place where morally significant freedom is no longer needed, right? We just have the kinds of we have freely formed the kinds of characters that are perfectly united with God and what God wants. But we couldn't form those characters if we didn't have the option at some part in our lives between morally good actions and morally bad actions. So we had to have had morally significant freedom at some point, even if we don't need to have it any longer. So again, on that strategy, we're denying something by the time we get to 6, right? Because if heaven is to be the kind of place where people have freely formed a character of the sort that I've been describing, God, and it's important for them to have freely formed it according to a libertarian or incompatibilist notion, right? God couldn't just sort of zap that kind of character into them. It wouldn't be a moral character on an incompatibilist understanding. But so just because there could be a world stage or a domain in which we lack morally significant freedom and have all these other goods doesn't mean that we could have an entire world without those domains, or that God could just create us in that initial domain.
Well, that's really interesting. I guess the main objection that I could come up with to that would basically be, it sounds like you're saying in order to have this certain type of character that we really value, you have to, at some point in time, have had this morally significant freedom to choose. But it kind of goes back to the example with God. The common understanding among Christians is that God cannot sin, not just that he chooses not to, but he cannot. But in his case, we don't want to say he had to have that type of character by at one point in time having morally significant freedom such that he could choose between good and bad. But then I guess the question is, why can't there be creatures who have the same type of character built in?
And the answer there is, I think, there are going to be some similarities between God's freedom and our freedom. I've tried to give an account elsewhere where what it means for God to be free, given the divine nature, is that God can't be constrained or thwarted or determined by anything outside of God's self. But of course, if we're talking about God here, like what could possibly determine God, right? Given and on an incompatibilist understanding of human freedom, when we act freely, we can't be wholly constrained. We can be influenced. Maybe some options are ruled out by things external to us, but we can't be determined, right? So human freedom and divine freedom are similar in this way. When both of us act freely, we're not being determined by something outside of ourselves. But we seem to be relevantly different than God in a number of ways, right? God necessarily exists. We don't. And at least on the traditional Christian picture, God has God's character necessarily, including God's moral character necessarily. But creatures don't. And in fact, if we necessarily had the moral character that we do, then right, in virtue of God creating us in a certain way with that character, then it looks like we're determined to have that kind of character. But if incompatibilism is true, then God couldn't determine us to have that character and us to be free. So there is going to be this asymmetry that you're asking about, right? If God's freedom is like that, why couldn't our freedom also be like that? And the answer is, I think, well, if we have a certain understanding of what the divine nature is and a certain understanding of what it means to be a creature, and part of what it means to be a creature is if we have free will, then we're not determined by anything outside of ourselves, including divine volitions, then that's going to explain why our freedom is going to be relevantly different than God's freedom in this particular case.
All right. That was just an awesome interview. Thank you so much, Kevin, for doing it.
It was my pleasure.
Before we go, would you like to say anything to sum up the discussion?
Again, I think that there's a number of different ways that you could reject Oppy's argument. It's really interesting, and it sort of pushes us to think very carefully about important Christian theological claims. But I don't think that the Christian needs to worry about the conclusion of Oppy's argument, given that there's a number of different ways that we could resist being forced to deny the existence of a particular understanding of God as creator.
Thank you so much for watching this interview with Dr. Timpe. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you value the work that I'm doing here at the Analytic Christian, please consider becoming one of my patrons. The link is in the description below. You can sign up to give any amount per month that you like, and I really appreciate all of my current patrons and their support. All right, that's it for now. See you soon.